So wandering around YouTube the other day, I came across Black Magic Craft's speed build of a stone footbridge. I thought it was pretty cool. I'm not going to do a speed build of it, but I would like to make one eventually. I decided to start getting things prepared in plans of maybe building this sometime in the near future. The first thing I noticed was that he's using Green Stuff's rolling pin texture for the cobblestone, which are a great product from what I'm told, but I actually don't have one. So I'm going to look and see what other options I have. I have these three different packing foams that are kind of just random pieces of foam that I found, and they're textured on the outside, and they have like a cobblestone-y skin to it. So we're going to paint these and see if the texture on these actually makes sense for the use of cobblestones. What I ended up doing is I cut out a little sheet of each just to make it easy to work with. So from softest to most firm. All of these I got as just packing materials for various things. So we're going to try and prime them. We're going to paint them, dry brush them. First we start off with our Mod Podge mix. If you're not familiar with Black Magic Craft, he has a blend that makes a great, basically a primer. The Mod Podge mixed with black will give you a good base coat slash really strengthen your pieces before you actually paint them once it dries. So this is just getting a little coat of that on each one of these. This black one is a little tricky because it is already black. It's hard to see on camera. It was hard to see in person, so I just kind of gave it a generous coat and went with it. I'm not super concerned about it. These ones, they're just for tests, so I'm not going to actually use these. One of the things I need to do to get prepped is open up my new wet palette. According to the internet, you need one of these to make life simple, so I ordered one off Amazon. It's a lot bigger than I thought it was. I was expecting something a couple inches big. I don't know why. This is like, I don't know, like 10 by 12. It's, well, maybe not that big, but it's big. Bigger than I thought it was. It came with instructions. I'm going to kind of look through those, take it out. I'm not really sure what I was expecting. It's, I know there's a sponge in there and some papers, so I took the papers out, checked out the sponge. I would imagine these are some sort of magical paper that help keep your paints hydrated. So add water, add paper, and your paints stay hydrated. I mean, I guess you should probably include your paints as well. Let's prep this bad boy. Once the paper soaked in the hot water for a little while, I put it in the palette and added my paints. We're just going to do a couple colors, basically a black base coat and a couple dry brush coatings to just see what kind of effects we get. These all have a pretty distinct texturing. This first one, the white one, has very, very soft composition to it. It doesn't really like to take paint. It didn't even take the Mod Podge very well, so these other ones are painting up a bit nicer. I'm thinking my best results are going to come from number 2 here. Number 3 works really good, but some of the bumps in it are kind of porous, and they kind of are like popped bubbles, and so they kind of leave unnatural looking craters in the texture. So after those dry, we get our first dark gray for our dry brushing. Get these in place. I got a paper towel. I'm just going to get the excess off here. Lay it on there. I come to find out that this is a brush that I have long since need to retire. Later on in the video, you'll see it shedding hair all over stuff. So it's not really spreading paint around very well. Get our first coat on panel number 2. Then get ready for panel number 3. That went on a little bit easier. Then once those dry, we start working on our gray dry brushing. Once they were all painted, I realized I didn't really like the color, so I ended up recoating them in a base coat of gray and doing some more dry brushing from there. Here you can see the 3 different comparisons. Confirming my suspicion, I ended up going with the second option with the black foam. I like to look at that more. I had some minis set up for some size comparisons. I wanted it to be about 4 inches wide. So from here I'll take my ruler and I'll measure out just how wide I want it, and we'll make some straight cuts here. And then I end up cutting out a thin slice of the upper portion of the foam in order to make the stonework of the bridge. Overall, I went with 4 inches wide by about 10 inches long. I could have gone longer, and I probably should have. I ended up kind of cutting myself short. It was kind of tricky finding a way to fix that, because once you have cut too much off, you kind of have to work with what you've got. A few more cuts and my panel was free from the main piece, and from there I ended up thinning it out by just shaving off more and more layers with my razor blade. I decided to trim it down because I realized that this foam was going to be way too thick for the build, and it took me a little while to actually accomplish getting it down to a 1/4 inch or so. Now it was here that I was starting to get pretty excited about this build when I could kind of imagine the arc, and it was because of this macaroni salad container that I kind of got this bright idea. I like the angle of the arches that this container had, so I cut it in half and I began to trim it out with the idea that where the flat portion's at, that would be where water would, say, run through under the bridge, and I was going to use these arches as a base support for the main stonework of my bridge, and as we'll see later, this kind of became the start of my problems. I spent some time here trying to figure out how I wanted these to fit together, and if and where I needed to trim stuff. I wasn't sure if I should take more off, so I decided to cut out the bottom part, and I started fitting it to the foam piece that I had cut out previously. It was only then that I realized that this piece might be a little short if I'm not careful, which of course, as you'll find out, I was not when it comes to the gluing process. I did a couple dry runs on fitting the foam over top of the arches, and I decided that I want to taper off the edges of them to make them flow flat with the ground to make it as seamless as possible. Now, I am in a place with my hobby that I do not have a Proxxon hot wire cutter of any sort to cut my foam with. If you look at the video that Black Magic Craft does of his build, he takes this time to tell you that there's a lot of complicated cuts and advanced tricks here, and I would have to agree with him on that. There's a lot of eyeballing, tricky cuts, measuring, trying to just make everything the right shape. This would all be a lot easier with a hot wire cutter. So I took some time, did some measurements, cut out a lot of bricks. This process right here took me a long time. It's not incredibly tedious, it's just time consuming. As this is kind of intended to be a hand-built bridge, a lot of these cuts are measured and eyeballed all at the same time. I didn't mind if the cuts were super exact, as long as they were pretty close to the previous cut, and I wasn't going to sweat it too much. I find it easier to just roll with what you have and not be too particular about the individual cuts and sizes and measurements. You know, thinking in a medieval fantasy setting, bricks and woodwork and stuff like that is not going to be manufactured, so the imperfections are actually what's going to make builds like this stand out and look good, as opposed to things being perfect and uniform. At this point, I begin preparing my brickwork. Like I said before, I don't have a Proxxon hot wire cutter or anything of that nature, so this process kind of takes a little while. It's not especially difficult, but it's time consuming in so much that you have to measure out the rough size of the pieces you want and then begin a little bit of a manufacturing process. I do this by cutting out several strips of the bricks that I want in the sizes that I want. I put them on top of each other and I begin to stack them, and in this case I'm cutting them about 1/4 inch wide. So I'll score the top and then I'll slice through again, and by slicing through the top layer I'll score the second layer, at which point I can take the second layer and I'll have my marks on them already, and I can put them on the third layer, and then I can just repeat this process until I have enough bricks for my purposes. I didn't have any made up, so I had to make about 50 or 60 bricks here for what I planned on doing. Again, I'm not super concerned about the size, as long as they're the right shapes and I can stack them easily enough. Once I have enough ready, I can gather all the bricks together for conditioning. This is done by getting some of your rocks that you have in your yard or your garden, put them in a tin of some sort, then put all your little bricks in there and give it a good shake. Do that for about 30 seconds or so, 60 seconds. And what this will do is put little micro indentations and scuffs and scratches and dents. Right here I'm using lava rock, which is very rough and pretty good for that, except that it's very dusty. And so you want to make sure that you blow it all off before you take these back and use them. You can see here all the dust coming out of there. I'm glad it was sunny out because this allows for scoring and distress that you can't achieve with just a brush and a toothpick and that sort of thing. I take a moment to try to visualize how I want this to look, and I do some final cuts, some final measurements, then I get ready to hot glue. I get my 100-year-old hot glue gun and I begin to stick it on there in preparation of putting the archways on there. This was my first major mistake in that I didn't measure the center of the foam in order to put the arches right in the very middle. So what ended up happening is this arch is too close to one side, and because of that I had to put the other arch parallel with it. So one of these sides of this bridge actually is a little steeper than the other, all said and done. I guess by the time it's all finished you won't be able to notice it too much, but I was really annoyed with myself that I made such a simple mistake that could easily have been prevented. Also, it should be mentioned that when I say that I saw the Black Magic Crafts speed build video of a stone arch bridge, that is to say I saw it, I didn't actually watch it. And so it wasn't until very late in this build that I actually took the time to watch it, only to realize that I had a lot of the same problems that he did, and I did not come up with the solutions that he did in order to fix them. So I felt pretty stupid that I didn't take the adequate time to plan. I was really just winging it, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, but I could have gone into this a bit more prepared and saved myself a lot of frustration. The perfect and probably biggest example of this is that you'll notice that for this entire build I use hot glue. This is not ideal. I didn't realize it would be such a heckling mess. It didn't even occur to me to hot glue the first layer of all my bricks, then use PVA glue to secure the rest of the bricks. These little cardboard pieces that you see are actually pieces of egg carton that I trimmed out and cut out, and I thought that these would make nice corner posts for the bridge, and I was partly right in that they are a good idea on paper, but they didn't really work well. I ended up having to trim them to fit the bridge itself. I ended up having to trim them to become flat enough to adhere bricks to, because they kind of flare out at the corners, and I think ultimately became more trouble than they were worth. After spending a lot of time trying to line up bricks and get them adhered, I got most of it done, and I ended up putting some capstones on each of these 4 pillars in order to kind of give them a final touch. And these are very rough squares. They're not exactly as far as angles or edges. I wanted to, at this point, make it look very rough and very cobbled together, like a peasant town made this bridge out of necessity, not that like a local government came and created a bridge for the sake of infrastructure. A little bit of hot glue allows me to finish up the end caps and cover up all those distracting holes that are in the top and in the seams. These bricks, you can see a little later on, are not going to be perfectly level or perfectly shaped, but this kind of rounds it all off, makes it look neat. I then added my bricks that I cut out previously that I tumbled through my rock bin, and I made the handrails, for lack of a better term, of the footbridge. I did these about 2 bricks high. I did 2 rows, just lined them up, trimming where needed in order to make them fit together on the arch itself. If you use perfectly square bricks here, you're going to have a lot of weird gaps, so I trimmed them down a little bit in order to make them fit together better. And I had a lot of bricks to spare, so I ended up go ahead and being picky about it. I then used the Mod Podge black paint mix in order to give it a nice base coat, taking time to make sure I got in between those cracks. Even though I trimmed those bricks down and made them pretty tight together, there was a lot of paint exposed even after I was done painting this. I had to go over it a couple times and really double check that I was getting everything, and even once I was all done painting, said and done, I still missed some spots and had to go back. So it's worth taking the time here if you're doing something like this and really looking at this at all spots from all angles. Once that was dry, I added a initial coat of a very dark gray paint in order to just give this a real base coat. Again, going through here and getting into the cracks was kind of tricky, and also this foam did not want to take paint super well. It was really kind of tricky to work with. I eventually let that dry. It looked pretty good already. So from here we started with our dry brushes. In order to get the color that I wanted, I simply added more white to my anamorphous glob of dark gray in order to lighten the shade up. When I knew that I was done with that color, I would simply add more white to it to make it just a little bit lighter. And this made it really easy to get different tones. Here I'm doing my second layer, dry brushing as I go, making sure that I'm looking at this from every angle every time I go over this so as to not miss it. What I like about dry brushing is that it's very gratifying once you start doing it, and the fact that it's very easy to do is also nice in that you can get very fast and loose with how you do this. And if you screw up, especially on something like stonework, all it does is add to the flavor. It doesn't really mess things up unless you're far too wet. By just slinging a brush around that has a little bit of paint on it, you can really give things a lot of interesting detail that you would find in nature. By adding more white to my paint, I'm able to get a nice highlighting color. I just graze over this to basically just hit the edges. And if you've never done terrain crafting before, I encourage you to try it, and when you do, stick with it, because this is the most gratifying moments, are this last 10% of the craft. It's these final dry brushing layers that make an item look good to like really awesome. To put something like this on your table that has very tiny and minute details as much as possible is really great. I know that a lot of people out there, when they start building terrain, are upset when they get partway through the build because it doesn't look like anything. It looks like trash to them. And once you can add painting and dry brushing and wash to it, you can add some details like this flocking here. to add moss to it, or mold or distressing, or any number of things, and it can really turn out really good. I really want to thank you all for watching. Not to sound cliche, but it really means a lot to me, and it goes a long way. Liking and subscribing is one thing, but really just share this with your friends. Get some people to see this, and hopefully you can be inspired by some of the things that inspire me. Thanks for watching.